Guys, I feel a little absurd to be doing this remotely when we're all in DC and in fact, like within pretty easy distance of the office.
And work at offices literally right next to each other.
Yeah. And Eric is like there right now within feet of our recording studio. And yet
I am.
The brutal and unforgiving fire drill schedule at the Brookings Institution has shifted us back to the virtual studio. What a tragedy. I'm sorry to not be there with you.
Yes, we take fire drills, we take fire safety seriously at the Brookings Institution, and I'm thankful to our many lovely safety people and fire marshals, but it does make recording a podcast difficult.
We'll see if we have one here at Carnegie. We had a phantom fire drill last week, and people started exiting the building and then realized it wasn't a real one, so.
I always love that when you have everyone in their, like business formal, like their suits and everything, like running down the stairs. It's a very DC moment.
My 3-year-old son had his first fire drill actually this past week at his daycare, and it was the talk of the town for at least 48 hours. He was very excited, but the students were all so disappointed when a fire truck did not come. Because I think a lot of the teachers were like talking it up. It's like, who knows? Maybe the firemen will come. And I had to explain to them, no, that would be very bad. If that is this how this story ended? Mommy and Daddy would be very upset and very nervous for you.
I will say the last apartment building that I lived at, the fire alarm went off once in like the middle of the night, and everyone stood around out in front of the building for something like 10 minutes before we all realized that because it's an older building, it doesn't automatically contact the fire department, so you have to place the call yourself. And it was just this great like social experiment in like group paralysis. Right? It's a bunch of like young professionals in DC. Presumably we have movers and shakers, and we're all just standing there waiting for someone to come help us.
Presumably someone thinks they're a mover and shaker. Who knows if they actually are? I have my doubts. But certainly someone thinks they are.
The next time there was a fire drill, I called 911.
Lesson learned.
Exactly.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am your regular co-host, Scott R. Anderson, thrilled to be back in the virtual studio by virtue of fire safety regulations and requirements with one of my other regular co-hosts, Quinta Jurassic.
Hello.
And our third regular co-host, Alan Rosenstein, has presumably incinerated himself, or otherwise is unavailable for at least this week, hopefully just this week. We are thrilled to be joined by Lawfare contributing editor, frequent guest, Eric Ciaramella. Eric, thank you for coming back on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me.
We have had a big couple weeks in a lot of fronts of national security news, particularly on the Ukraine front, on the civil servant front, and on the intelligence community front, all issues of concern to you. And we're thrilled to have you here with us to talk over all of them in what we are calling the Up in Flames edition, in honor and tribute to what the Brookings Institution hopefully will not be doing anytime soon, at least so long as we stay up with our drills and fire safety requirements.
Take that, Richard Nixon.
Take that. Topic 1 for this week. Prime deliverables in 2 days or less. The Biden administration and its European allies coughed up a number of big wins for Ukraine at a meeting of the G7 and subsequent Ukraine Peace Summit this past week, ranging from a new U.S.-Ukraine security agreement to a commitment to provide $50 billion in assistance. But are these measures game changers, especially with political changes in both Europe and the United States on the horizon? Topic 2. Trying to F us. Policy advisors to former President Trump reportedly have some big plans for government employees if he is elected to a second stint in the White House, including the return of Schedule F, a reorganization of the civil service that would have gutted job protections and made it easier to replace civil servants with partisan loyalists. How big a problem are these plans and how feasible are they really? Topic 3. Revenge of the Nerds. A little-known intelligence agency within the State Department, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, or INR, has gotten some great press of late, celebrating several notable analytic victories it secured, often in dissent from the rest of the intelligence community. Is there some secret to INR's success, or is its reputation overblown? For our first topic, let me hand it over to you to get us started, Quinta.
It has been a busy weekend of news when it comes to U.S. relations with Ukraine. So over the weekend at a multilateral peace conference in Switzerland, nearly 80 countries signed onto a communique calling for the territorial integrity of Ukraine to be the basis of any peace with Russia. And the U.S. also committed to a bilateral security agreement with Ukraine. At the same time, at the G7, the US and a number of European countries unveiled a plan to provide Ukraine with a pretty hefty loan backed by interests from Russian assets that were frozen following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Eric, I want to turn to you first. What is this peace conference? What happened? And then after we get through that, let's talk about the security agreement, because I think there's a lot to get through there.
Sure. Thanks, Quinta. So, this peace summit was about a year in the making. This was an initiative of President Zelensky and his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, who unveiled in late 2022 the so-called 10-point peace formula for Ukraine, which laid out the broad principles of what the Ukrainian government thought should be the basis for a just and lasting peace. And they're not, overly surprising points, things like nuclear safety and food security and security arrangements, and so on and so forth. What the Ukrainians have been trying to do for the last year is build global support for that peace formula. And so they convened a series of 4 meetings at the level of national security advisors, starting in June of last year in Copenhagen, then a follow-on meeting in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, a follow-on meeting in the fall in Malta, and then in January in Davos, prior to the World Economic Forum. And those meetings were meant to kind of flesh out and discuss in a wider format than just Ukraine's immediate partners in Europe and North America and East Asia, sort of what these principles might mean in practice and to gain the widest possible support. So the Ukrainians launched this summit in the hope that as many heads of state and government from around the world would join as possible. In a sense, just the fact that it happened is a success. There was representation from more than 90 countries and a significant number of heads of state, including outside of, Europe and Ukraine's immediate partners. The communique itself didn't get the sign-on from all of the participants in the peace summit. I mean, notable absences were India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa that sent representation to the summit, but didn't end up signing the communique. China notably did not attend the summit at all in any capacity, which was a big disappointment for the Ukrainians and the Europeans who had been trying to court Xi Jinping to kind of cleave him away from Vladimir Putin. But, I wouldn't say that there was kind of a major breakthrough in this summit. The Ukrainians did try and focus the conversation on areas of the broadest kind of global agreement to include nuclear safety, humanitarian exchange of prisoners, and the return of deported children, and food security and freedom of navigation. And so those were the main points in the summit communique. The Ukrainian hope is that, now there's kind of this format, and from this, there can be a bit of work on the different points over the next several months, building towards a second summit, potentially in Saudi Arabia, they've talked about, which may include the Russians and be an opportunity to kind of discuss this broad Ukrainian conception of a peace plan with the Russians, and again, having on their side gained the backing of a larger kind of coalition of countries. So again, overall, good that it happened, but, no major breakthrough there.
And what about this security agreement between the US and Ukraine? So David Sanger had a write-up in the New York Times that sort of had a bit of, on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, it is a security agreement. On the other hand, there are all these sort of weaknesses, Sanger argued, and loopholes. We had a piece on Lawfare by Jack Goldsmith, sort of analyzing it and saying that it was a lot less of a big deal than it appeared to be. What do you make of it?
Yeah, so I think, it is a big deal in my view. It's been a long time in the making. Again, this kind of, when you look at the origins of this security agreement, it goes back, a year to the time when the G7 countries on the margins of the NATO summit in Vilnius last July signed this declaration of joint support for the Ukrainians that later 24 other countries signed on to. And it pledged, they pledged in this declaration to negotiate and sign a series of bilateral agreements, kind of a lattice work of agreements that would come together on a multilateral level, outside of and adjacent to NATO, but that would kind of lock in long-term support and make it a little bit more predictable and sustainable. And so, the U.S. government had the intention of negotiating a security agreement rather quickly and started the negotiations last August. And then things started to go awry in Congress in September with the funding fight, the ouster of Kevin McCarthy, the interregnum before Speaker Johnson got his position, the intervening Hamas attack against Israel, and the subsequent kind of refocusing of attention towards the Middle East. And so the negotiations went off track as the administration waited for Congress to vote on the supplemental, which, as listeners know, didn't happen until April. Once Congress voted on the supplemental aid package, the Defense Department and State Department and National Security Council reinvigorated the talks with the Ukrainians on this agreement and then finalized it over the course of a few weeks. In the intervening time, more than a dozen other countries had signed their own security agreements, starting with the UK back in January, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, a bunch of the Nordic countries. So the US wanted to be the country kind of shaping the conversation and the terms of the agreements, and ended up being kind of late to the game in an already very crowded space. So a lot of countries were anxiously awaiting our agreement to see what the wording would be, what the structure would be. I think it answered some questions and posed a lot of new questions. So just getting to kind of the strengths and weaknesses, I think one of the strengths is that it orients our long-term, military support, the planning, the resourcing discussions around this concept of credible defense and deterrence capabilities. And, that's kind of the operative phrase, similar to the principle of qualitative military edge that we use in our military aid to Israel, dating back to the Cold War. And so the principle here is that, through a suite of capabilities, through training, intelligence support, so on and so forth, we, the United States, intend to equip Ukraine with this credible defense and deterrence capability in order to repel the ongoing Russian attack, but then to build up deterrence over the long haul so that if there is a cessation of hostilities at some point, Russia can't just use that period to rearm and attack Ukraine again. So we're trying to put in place the pieces for a much bigger strategy about, basically ensuring that Ukraine is, a fortress that Russia can't, keep moving forward on the battlefield without incurring ever greater costs. So that's an important innovation. Another interesting thing here that we should talk about is kind of the legal status of the agreement. It is overall a binding executive agreement, similar to the agreement that we signed with Bahrain in September of last year, but with significant non-binding elements, including the annex, which kind of goes into detail about the different types of capabilities that the United States intends to provide to Ukraine. The entirety of that annex is non-binding, and then there are some clauses, as far as I can tell, in the actual agreement itself that are non-binding. But the core part of it is a binding executive agreement, as far as I understand, done under the president's constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. Now, the question is, and the Ukrainians have been asking, well, what's to prevent a future president from withdrawing? And that's a fair question. And that's where Congress comes in. And just to put in a plug for a piece I wrote back in March on Lawfare about kind of the different options for the White House and Congress to work together on kind of codifying an agreement, parts of an agreement, whether it's in Article 2 treaty format, which I think is hard to imagine how that would happen, or some form of a congressional executive agreement. But there are ways for Congress to do this. The aid vote in April shows that there is still a wide bipartisan majority in favor of supporting Ukraine. And so you could see a path, even in a very difficult election year, for the Biden administration to work with, both the House and Senate to come up with some formulation for putting our policy on this more sustainable and predictable footing, and for gathering the allies together around this idea, with U.S. leadership. So lots to discuss. I mean, I think, Jack made some really good points in his piece about some of the weaknesses, but I would just highlight that based on where we came from, this is a significant step forward in articulating our kind of long-term interests in ensuring that the Ukrainians have this self-defense and deterrence capability. It's going to be a significant document that the allies rally around. They're always looking to see what we're doing. And I think we can use it, particularly going into the NATO summit in a few weeks in Washington, as kind of an organizing principle to get the allies around the idea that we need to start zooming out from this emergency paradigm of, one-off kind of aid tranches with huge question marks looming over the next one, to saying, no, we're in this really for the long term, and we're looking at a 10-year horizon and trying to pierce this Russian narrative that time is on Putin's side and he can just wait us out.
Scott, how would you describe the sort of legal status of this agreement? Where does it stand, and how is it maybe the same or different than other security commitments the U.S. has made?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Eric captured the kind of legal status correctly. I mean, there's definitely language in here that would be binding. The general rule that the State Department has, particularly over the last 2 decades, been much more consistent about applying, or older agreements aren't always entirely consistent, is that verbs imply a legally binding commitment under sometimes domestic law, like in a contract, but usually for purposes of international bilateral agreements, an international agreement. And you do see that language throughout here. There's some variability with other countries, like UK famously sees will as non-binding, but shall as binding. But this has been the US practice more or less for the last 20 years or so, and prior to that too, just not quite as consistently. And you see that here in a number of places. And that does imply that this certainly is an international agreement. And in our system, the executive branch's position has been, and I think most people accept it to some degree, although the exact scope is always a question, is that if the president has the constitutional and in some cases even statutory authority to do something on his own authority, then he also has the authority to enter into an international agreement to commit the United States to do that. That's a big departure from the usual way we make treaties in the constitutional text, the way the framers anticipated, which was going to be with approval of 2/3 of the Senate. But even the Constitution acknowledges there are compacts and other sort of like lesser types of international agreements that may not fit into that zone. And this practice of executive agreements has really grown pretty dramatically over the last century, particularly since World War II, and is now kind of the dominant way we make international agreements. So it's not unusual in that regard. But it does have some practical constraints. I mean, the agreement says the United States either party can withdraw from this on 6 months' notice. So in theory, you should at least have a period where if the Trump administration were to come in 2025 and say, we want out of this, they would at least have 6 months by which they would be obligated by it. That's meaningful. And it's worth noting the Trump administration, even as it was withdrawing from all sorts of international agreements during its first time in office, did so in a manner compliant with those treaties and generally compliant with international law. Like it followed the rules to get out of the agreements. So I think there's a reason to think there's a good chance they would still abide by that. Jack Goldsmith's criticism was essentially, this doesn't say anything that strong. And he suggests that it would be better if Biden had done stronger language, but in a non-binding format without any pretension that there's internationally legally binding. I'm not really persuaded by that argument, if I'm being honest. Like, I don't think Biden's credibility and his willingness to go to bat for Ukraine is in any way in doubt. And so it's kind of not that useful to throw a bunch of strong language out there. It's something Biden does pretty regularly anyway, and those around him. The real goal here is to try and set out a path that will have enough pressure on a future administration who may be less inclined to back Ukraine to guide and shape U.S. policy past the end of the Biden administration, potentially, or at least past this moment. And to do that, you do have to walk a careful line between not overpromising in a way that will lead political actors to buck the commitment, but also doing something that's meaningful. And this walks that difficult line. So I think the most legally interesting part of this agreement is the security commitment part of it, where essentially the agreement says in binding language that in the event of a future armed attack or threat thereof against Ukraine, the two states will meet within 24 hours and may mutually decide to do a bunch of steps, including economic sanctions and other measures, including military measures. That's kind of as close as it gets expressly to a use of force, although it suggests, that's in the range of menu options that might be on there. And also notes that future aggression or threat of aggression against either party would be a matter of grave concern to the other party. This is kind of interesting language. Eric mentioned the Bahrain agreement that looks a lot like this that came out last year, both of which are really interesting. I think these actually push the limits of what's been done in this sort of executive agreement in the past. Traditionally, security commitments like this are a line where the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, including quite vocally under then Chairman Joe Biden for much of the 1980s, 1990s, would usually traditionally maintain security commitments that come close to something like we see with the NATO agreement, really are things that should be approved by an Article 2 treaty. And that's how we've done most of our bilateral security agreements. That's how we do NATO. That's how we do most of our other multilateral security agreements that aren't currently extant, but are still out there or aren't relied on as heavily as NATO. So this is unique to see it push in that direction. What it doesn't have that NATO does have, because NATO doesn't firmly require anyone to attack, to respond militarily either. NATO really similarly does primarily obligate consultation over a possible response. But the one thing NATO agreement does, and certain other older model treaties do that this one doesn't, is it says an attack on one will be considered attack on all, essentially. I'm paraphrasing. The strong implication there is that it is a kind of pre-authorization for collective self-defense. Basically, they're pre-signing off on a military response, pre-consenting to it. If one is attacked, then they're consenting the other states to respond in collective self-defense with them. I think is the best way to read that in terms of its operational international legal effect. This doesn't quite have that. It's saying we'll have consultations. At that consultations, maybe the Ukrainians will say, collective self-defense, please come help us defend ourselves. But I think that's the gap probably where the executive and SFRC are saying that's still the thing that requires Article 2 type approval, and they didn't get there. That to me is like the main line of criticism of this thing, is that they just didn't decide to go to Congress. Like they could have done some stronger things with Congress. Now, my guess is they didn't go because they thought it was a bridge too far, right? And a lot of stuff for security assistance, that's really the main thrust of this agreement. You actually need appropriations, meaning you need both chambers of Congress, not just the Senate, and the numbers just aren't there in the House to do this stuff this far in advance. We just saw how big a fight it was just to do the latest tranche of assistance. For stronger international commitments that aren't tied to appropriations, you could have just gone to the Senate, and maybe you could have gotten 2/3 of the Senate. I think it's a close call. My guess is an election year would be hard. If it weren't an election year, maybe you could get close to 2/3 in the current Senate. But, it's a hard trade-off there. I don't blame the Biden administration for it. I get why that maybe wasn't politically feasible on the time frame they're operating in, but it ties their hands in terms of what they're able to do. I think this did probably as much as they can do with what they have available to them, but the tools at that point are somewhat limited. It's just hard to bind future presidents, which is what this agreement's essentially trying to do.
Let's then talk about this loan situation, which I confess, after reading some of the details in the New York Times, confuses me deeply. So if I understand correctly, and I'm sure I'm about to mess this up, it is a loan to Ukraine that is backed by frozen Russian assets abroad. And I will say there's a very catty little note in the New York Times story that says, Russian assets that, inexplicably, Mr. Putin left abroad before the 2022 invasion. But the loan is not backed by the assets themselves. It is backed on the interest from the assets that will accrue. Scott is shaking his head.
But it's not your fault. This is the media's fault because they've gotten this wrong pretty consistently.
Fake news.
So here's the way the structure is. I think this is very clever. It is something that folks have been talking about a little bit, but this kind of ties together a bunch of threads of different solutions that have been kind of coming out in the last few months about how we might do some sort of agreement. Essentially, about 2 months ago, the European Union agreed to give annual payments to Ukraine of about like $3 billion. Well, that's based off current market conditions, based off a really, really unique bundle of assets. And this is kind of like a historical good luck that we've ended up in this position. But what essentially happened is that when Russia's assets were frozen in 2022, which happened very quickly and happened particularly in Europe very quickly, in a way particularly affecting central bank assets that I think Russia did not expect, and many countries did not expect because Europe had not traditionally been willing to go that far. Tons of those assets, actually the lion's share of them, like $200 billion worth of assets, were held in Euroclear. This is a central securities depository in Europe. It services the whole world, though, and is one of these main interchanges that financial institutions use to move assets back and forth. So if you have an entity that is doing a lot of international business, like most states, particularly large economies like Russia, they have a ton of money in these clearance houses that are constantly changing hands as they, trade in currencies one for the other, buy goods, provide different currency streams and loans to different financial institutions that are associated with, things like that. Well, here's the thing that nobody fully anticipated, I don't think. If they did, then they were brilliant. They were really deeper in the weeds on this. I think most people were. Euroclear has a really unique contract with these arrangements. They basically say, we're going to hold your assets for a short period of time, but we're not a holding bank. You're not supposed to keep assets here for a long time. And to discourage states from doing that, they essentially put a time limit on the assets that they hold. And then after that time limit expires, Euroclear gets to take those assets, pull them in cash, and invest them and keep the profits for itself. They do this as an incentive to keep these things moving. But starting in 2022, Russia couldn't do that anymore because they were frozen. So Euroclear had to hold them. So under Euroclear's contractual arrangements, they essentially have had these hundreds of billions of dollars that they've been able to just reinvest in a period where interest rates are super, super high. And they have been getting what are called what would have been labeled, I think quite correctly, windfall profits of an extraordinary sum. Over the last few years, they've been able to essentially lend out this large sum of money. So when news reports say this is interest on Russian assets, that's not quite right. Traditionally, interest of the type we're used to from like any sort of account or most financial arrangements accumulates to the person who owns the underlying assets. That is not what's happening here. These are not Russian interests. Russia, at least under contractual law, as Euroclear enters into and is enforced under Belgian European law, Russia has no claim to these assets. These are Euroclear assets. And the European Union, a few months ago, when they decided to give this money to Ukraine, they did what every government does with every financial institution or business. They taxed it. They imposed taxes under European and Belgian law on Euroclear, saying we're going to tax these assets and we're going to commit them to spending them on Ukraine, leaving some residual to Euroclear and to the Belgian government, who all wanted a slice of it, perhaps understandably, but it is in the nature of businesses and governments to want slices of such things. So that's the funds here. So this bypasses, at least in the short term, all of those international legal issues that have made freezing Russian assets such a point of concern for primarily European governments at this point. Biden administration has come out in favor of doing it after a long kind of consideration of these legal concerns. Still has them, I think, but like is willing to say the risk is worth it. But the Europeans weren't quite there. This doesn't deal with that because you don't touch Russian assets for part of this. The downside of this is that, this stream of assets may not ultimately be enough to pay out the $50 billion loan. We just don't know. It's, this is going to be over 15-year, 20-year, 30-year term. Interest rates could drop. Something else could happen. All sorts of contingencies should come in. And so the question is what happens to repaying these assets? If a peace agreement is reached, the assets are unfrozen. The G7 has already said we're only going to unfreeze these if reparations are paid to Ukraine by Russia. And so I suspect part of this agreement, although I haven't seen it included in press coverage, is that in that event, the lending states will have a claim against those reparations payments. So Ukraine will have to pay that sum back to these lenders. That's how they'll make them whole for the $50 billion. The alternative, though, is maybe there's never a peace agreement. Maybe this funds dwindle. Maybe something else happens. Maybe Euroclear loses in European court and Russia gets its assets back. Something like that. Lots of contingencies could happen if they seem unlikely. Who's left holding the bag then? That's where the question of seizing Russian assets comes back into the picture, because that's the last avenue of resort that these states would have to get their money back, essentially. Who knows if they're willing to do it at that point? And so it doesn't completely get you out from under the picture, but kicking the can down the road makes a big difference, because the hardest part about seizing assets now is that there's no international justice mechanism to clarify here's what is owed to Ukraine by Russia for reparations. There's no tribunal, but there are steps being taken in that direction. 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years from now, there might be judgments in Ukraine's favor coming from international bodies. Like the trajectory is there to get there. The hard part has always been that Ukraine needs money sooner than those mechanisms move. And this kind of bridges that gap. And I think it's a model, frankly, you could replicate not just based off these Euroclear funds. If states are willing to do it, and are willing to accept the risk that down the road, maybe one day we'll have to seize these assets, even if we're not ready to do it yet, then you could do this to do advances based on all other proportions of the frozen Russian assets. So it could be, I think, a mechanism of squaring that time situation, and giving international adjudicatory mechanisms the time they need to get set up and actually begin looking at this while still getting Ukraine some compensation sooner. It's worth noting also, I should say, these funds right now, this first tranche, these aren't compensation. These aren't reparations. This is a kind of ex gratia payment these are discretionary spending by these governments based on tax revenue. So unless there's some side agreement with Ukraine that I'm not aware of, these funds shouldn't necessarily be deducted from the reparations that Russia owes. Russia still owes the full amount to Ukraine. So in that sense, it's actually in some ways better than seizing Russian assets, although I know the initial sum is less than the $200 to $300 billion that some people say you could get from seizing Russian assets. It's still a big drop in the bucket.
Eric, I'm curious for what your read on this loan is. How big of a deal is it going to be for Ukraine?
I mean, I think it is going to help, but I do worry that it sort of leads Ukraine's partners to think that the problem is solved on the issue of longer term funding. And I mean, even as we saw with our own supplemental aid bill, which was valued at $61 billion in military and economic support, I mean, that funding runs out probably by the end of this calendar year. And so again, another $50 billion, it helps. plug the gaps and hold the Ukrainians over and keep the lights on. But there are major, major, major costs that are going to keep accumulating, both to fund, Ukraine's current operations, to help them build up these deterrence capabilities over the long run that I talked about earlier. I mean, we haven't talked at all about the electricity grid. Russia, over the course of 6 weeks, managed to take out almost all of Ukraine's non-nuclear power generation capabilities. And there's no real clear solution to get that generation capacity back online before the winter. So there are major costs here that I think, Western leaders still have not kind of publicly accounted for the fact that this is going to require a very sustained and significant investment. And so, again, I applaud the move. I think it's good. Maybe there will be more, like Scott was saying, this opens up a new vehicle that we can use in the future. But I think it still doesn't get away from this conversation we're going to have, including, in Congress again, about, at what level are we willing to fund and support Ukraine going forward for an indefinite period until there is some sort of ceasefire or settlement on the horizon. And I just don't see despite some people who say, Ukraine could just end the war tomorrow if Zelensky goes to talks, and, that's sort of the J.D. Vance line. To me, that's fantastical, and I see no evidence that the Russians are willing to stop. So with no end to the war on the horizon, this is still going to create a big bill for us going down the road.
Well, from one set of future planning to another set of future planning, let us turn to the domestic front, where we have been hearing rumors for weeks, months now about plans that a future Trump administration, a President 47, President Trump, not 45, as I understand has become a point of debate among his supporters.
Yeah, this is a long-running source of debate over how to classify Grover Cleveland.
Yes, exactly. And so now we may find ourselves back in the same boat. And if we do, it appears that at least some people who are former advisors, former senior advisors, perhaps current advisors, have some big plans. And a lot of it comes back to a little regulatory move called Schedule F. This was originally a measure that the Trump administration imposed in October 2020. So just as it was preparing to enter into the election and then shortly thereafter leave office, although I didn't know that at the time, that essentially sought to take big swaths, or potentially at least big swaths of civil servants, and move them out of the competitive service and accepted service, these tools processes that are used to hire them currently, and into a new mechanism called Schedule F, in which they would be positions that could be filled quite easily. And by virtue of the definition that was applied for who should be moved there, which is a definition taken from a statute that says that is describing positions that, I'm quoting here, are confidential, policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating character, are not eligible for various types of removal protections that normally apply to positions in these different services. And so you would essentially be putting into place a schedule where a mechanism by which lots of civil servants would be removable close to at will, or very close by much more generously, and then could be appointed without having to go through the usual competitive service, essentially creating a mechanism that people were concerned at the time would allow the Trump administration to fill the bureaucracy with lots of supporters without the usual protections that are provided civil servants, and kicking a bunch of current civil servants who've been there for years through several administrations of both political parties to the curb effectively. The Biden administration has rescinded that. They've taken measures to try and protect the reimposition of this schedule, but people like Russ Vought, who is the former OMB director for former President Trump, and is now heading up Project 2025, an initiative to do some planning for what a future Trump administration will do if it re-enters office, has essentially urged for reimposing this day one, and moving lots of civil servants to Schedule F, and by some accounts at least removing them somewhat summarily. I want to start with you, Quinta, on this. What is the discussion around this proposal? I mean, it strikes me as a pretty radical proposal, and we know confidence in government, confidence in public institutions of all stripes is been at a historical low really for the last decade or two. But it still strikes me as a pretty radical move to be putting out there as a policy proposal. As worth noting, Trump administration itself hasn't formally embraced this Operation 2025, although President Trump has promised he's going to reimpose Schedule F and reissue that executive order and employ it aggressively, I think was the phrasing he used. How big a threat is this, and where does it fit into kind of the broader scheme of accountability for former President Trump if he were to re-enter the White House?
I think it's a big threat. I mean, I'm Eric, I'll be curious for your thoughts as someone who has actually been within the belly of the beast, since I'm just commenting from someone who, has observed it from outside. So John Oliver's HBO show, of all things, did I shouldn't say of all things. They often do kind of things like this. They had a big segment on Project 2025 on this week's episode. So I normally do not watch that show, but I did tune in because someone tipped me off to it. And
I've been quoted on that show. I had a lawfare piece.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, sorry to diss John Oliver then.
Yeah, don't diss John Oliver.
The Oliver segment I thought was really interesting, not only in how it discussed, the substance of Schedule F, but in how he kind of framed it. The framing was basically, okay, I know this sounds really boring. It's about, the federal government system for HR. Essentially, it sounds like I'm going to put you right to sleep, but you have to believe me that this is really, really important. And then he kind of walks through, all of the reasons, which, the short version, I think it is fair to say, is that it's basically an attack on the idea of a professionalized civil service and of expertise, apolitical expertise in government. It's a sort of return to a sort of personalized spoils system that hasn't existed in the US since the 1880s. And for good reason. And I think there are sort of two ways to understand it. One is that for Trump himself, he always chafed at the notion of the federal government as something that existed outside him personally. And this would give him much greater control to, as you say, to sort of fire people at will and essentially put together. There's a great quote in a CNN article about this from someone who opposes the plan, who described it as a government made of, and I quote, an army of suck-ups. Which if you're Trump, that's great. If you're anybody else, that's not so great. Because you actually do want people there who can say, Mr. President, this isn't a good idea because X, Y, and Z. But I think the other aspect is that Trumpism, such as it is, has always been a kind of weird alliance between Trump's own instincts and the sort of more hardline, far-right elements of the Republican Party. And if you are coming at it from a sort of ideological right lens, you can say, this is a great way to destroy the administrative state, I think, or something along those lines was the line that Steve Bannon used early in the Trump administration, that it's essentially taking a sledgehammer to the sort of the entire architecture of the federal government as it has been built up over the last, 150 years. And so there's a kind of a double win from the perspective of Trump and his allies. But I do think it's extraordinarily dangerous. And Eric, I want to get your thoughts. And after that, we should also talk about what legal problems Trump might or might not run into if he tries to implement this. But before that, I mean, from your perspective, what's your read on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of dangers are twofold. Number one, it's, as you mentioned, removing senior civil servants who might have been in a position to, serve as guardrails against policies that are truly detrimental to, the rule of law and America's interests, as we broadly conceive of them. But I think that's only one part of it. And I actually would worry about the bigger element, which is just the sheer incompetence of, many of the people that the Trump administration brought in the first time. They had trouble filling the 4,000, political appointee Schedule C positions in the first administration, ended up filling many of them with people who didn't know what they were doing. The idea that they would be able to fill potentially, I mean, I've seen anywhere between 50,000 to 150,000 positions that would meet this, I forget the language, but, as Scott mentioned, the kind of decision-making, confidential policy-making and advice kind of roles, which the Trump administration never spelled out the first time because they didn't get the chance after the initial Schedule F executive order was issued, because I think the department and agency heads had 90 days to come up with the list of the positions. And then by then Trump had lost the election and we were in the middle of the transition. So we don't even know what positions these would be. But I'm worried about the basic competence of government. And I think a lot about Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, about the transitions in the departments of energy, agriculture, and commerce, if I'm not mistaken, where he was kind of talking about this, it seems like this mundane issue of kind of big project management and basic government. But then he explained very clearly how, kind of the lack of care and knowledge from the Trump team during the transition about these really, really big problems, and issues that the federal government is responsible for, and the role of senior civil servants in managing those issues is scary in its own way, and in some ways scarier than kind of the big issues of kind of loose nuclear weapons or whatever it is. So, again, I worry about it in two different ways. I worry that, a lot of the way the government operates is through, trust and certain amount of institutional pride. I mean, people at, State Department officers are very proud in general of working at the State Department and take their job seriously. CIA officers the same way, Commerce Department people the same way, and there's certain institutional cultures, and those cultures are, often embodied in the senior civil servants who've risen up to management roles and who are looked to as role models, and who kind of understand the building that they operate in. They understand the personnel systems. Again, not all of them are great managers. There are clearly reforms that need to happen because sometimes, people do fail upward in the federal bureaucracy. But by and large, when you're a junior officer and you have a career in front of you in the federal government, you look to these kind of lifers who've been in the system for 20, 30 years and are now commanding like significant positions of authority. And if all of those are sidelined and you get, 25-year-old random campaign person who's now in charge of major programs with multi-billion-dollar budgets, I mean, there's going to be significant kind of trust issues and basic dysfunctionality that I think is going to be baked into the way government operates. And that's a real risk.
Here's how I've been thinking about this increasingly, and I'm kind of curious whether this jibes with how you guys are thinking about this, which is, I think the bigger threat of this, in part because I don't think it's actually legally feasible to do it the full scale that's described, and we can get into why that is another reason, let alone policy or management-wise feasible for the reasons you just noted, Eric. Like, they really did not get positions filled very effectively last time, taking over the course of 4 years even. My concern with this is it's more about kind of the lesser included offenses of what the threat of doing this could enable and facilitate. On one hand, maybe it's like a bit of an Overton window sort of strategy, which we love talking about on this podcast and other places, this idea that, I think this probably is what the Project 2025 thing is. We're going to throw out a bunch of ideas so radical and so huge that even if we do something half this far, it'll be a pretty disruptive act, but it'll look a lot more reasonable comparatively. It sets the parameters for negotiation, particularly within like the kind of conservative Republican caucus with Congress and other folks, sets the parameters pretty favorably from the outset if these ideas get grabbed, even if they're not implementable in the end. And then, is that even if you never take the step of implementing this fully, or if you only implement it partially, like, just do Schedule F, but don't actually start removing people left and right, you set up a real chilling effect for civil servants, right? Like, all of a sudden they are at risk of facing real career consequences, even if they have good reason to believe that they would actually win in court if they went and sued over it, if they were actually fired for it. It's a long road to get there. Like, litigation's painful, and it's just so contrary to, frankly, like the civil servant mentality that I still have in my heart and soul, which is that you really are there to work for the political leadership to some extent and to preserve the institutions. And sometimes that is a little bit of a get along sort of attitude that's less inclined to do things like become a litigant in litigation over the course of several years against that agency. It certainly will happen at a certain point. And if so, like, what is the most realistic risk that comes out, the most realistic threat, as opposed to this whole idea that all of a sudden, we're going to have a mostly mega civil service? I don't think that's feasible, but like, what are the more immediate threats of an administration willing to at least put something like this on the table? Like, what is the real thing? What is the impact going to be January 21st, 2025, if Trump issues this without really like, even if he ends up not following through on fully switching over to the civil service, like, how will that impact that? I guess for you as a former government employee, like, what is the government civil servant's mentality, and like, how would the threat of this sort of action, even if imperfect and potentially legally flawed, impact how you approach your job and your work?
I mean, I think it would be very demoralizing to a lot of civil servants. You know, the whole narrative, the first Trump administration about the deep state and all of that, I think it really did get under people's skin over the long haul because, you know, like I was saying earlier, a lot of civil servants really do have a lot of pride in their work. And to constantly be accused of, you know, being treasonous or whatever, I mean, eventually it gets to you, even if at first it sounds patently ridiculous and you're just trying to do your job. But then over time, you know, if you're constantly questioned in your motivations and you're constantly accused of, you know, working with foreign governments or working with, you know, Democrats or whatever it is, the press, to try and undermine the president, there's just a certain trust that breaks down. I mean, ultimately the president is supposed to be the head of the federal bureaucracy and the caretaker of it. And, you know, when he's at war with the federal bureaucracy, again, I think it has a huge kind of cost in terms of morale. I would be curious to hear from Quinta in particular about kind of legal issues, because I have heard from some, you know, people who are at the different departments that, you know, there is already kind of talk of what would a class action suit look like. And, you know, do we work through the different unions, you know, of which there are some for some federal employees? You know, how would that look? What are the legal options? And so I do think people are getting ready to fight this, but I think they're still trying to figure out A, what the order will look like, and B, what their legal options available to them would be.
So after doing a little bit of reading on this, my impression is that there are two different kind of problems that this might run into, or potentially more than two, but at least two. Let's start there. The first is a due process concern. So basically, if, you know, you hired people through the traditional merit system with the expectation that they would have all of these traditional protections in their roles, and then suddenly switch them into a role where they don't have those protections, that they might be able to bring some kind of a due process claim, whether individually, I don't know about the class action aspect, but I could certainly see that, you know, an individual could bring a suit either, you know, once they were switched, or, you know, if they were already switched once they were fired. The other constraint is, of all things, the major questions doctrine, which is this doctrine that has, I would describe it as sort of made up out of whole cloth in recent years by the Supreme Court, but that comes from a sort of long-standing conservative concern with what's called the non-delegation doctrine. But basically has to do with the executive branch using statutory provisions and kind of stretching them beyond what, in the eyes of the courts, they were originally meant to do in situations of great political and economic significance, and where there's a novel reading of the statute. This is a very, very high-level overview, but I think those are the main points. This would certainly be of political significance. I think last time around it reclassified, or would have reclassified, around 50,000 people. Economic, I don't know, but I think you could make the case. And, you know, the courts are conservative, but they're not necessarily in line with all of Trump's agenda. And this is an instance where you could really imagine that the Supreme Court might be skeptical of an effort by the executive to kind of take the statutory authorization to create exceptions to the merit system and just kind of make a loophole that's so big that it just kind of swallows everything. I think it's also worth noting that, so the Biden administration, as I think we mentioned, there is a final rule that came out of OPM that essentially implements some protections against Schedule F that could be rescinded by a new Trump administration, but it would have to go through the process under the Administrative Procedure Act. And last time around, that was one of the big issues that tended to trip the Trump administration up. So both the DACA and the census cases, the thing that got them kind of booted out of court from the Supreme Court. was the fact that they'd screwed up the APA process. And so I could definitely imagine, that's more of a procedural issue, obviously, than a challenge on the substance. But I could definitely imagine that if they're, rushing to get this through and kind of don't, dot all the I's and cross all the T's and scramble, that you could very well be successful in pointing to aspects of the record that could get some effort to put this in place thrown out. But I do think, this is kind of uncharted territory, right? Which is sort of what I'm pointing to with the major questions point. Like, we really don't know what this would look like legally. And I think that, as you say, Eric, I'm sure there would be a really fierce fight over it, but I don't have a good sense of what the outcome of that might be.
I think also, again, if I'm understanding this correctly, it's not something that can, you issue the executive order and then the next day all these people are fired. First of all, I don't think any of them will be fired from the civil service. That is clearly illegal. So I think it's about reclassifying positions to Schedule F and basically forcing the people in them to choose either you stay a civil servant or foreign service officer and you retain all your federal benefits and whatnot, but you have to move out of this position, or you stay in the position and convert to Schedule F. And so I don't see any pathway, unless I'm missing something here, about how you kind of force strip civil servants of their benefits and status. You recode the position. But to do that, usually, again, there's a huge internal process in order to do that. And I think if it's done too quickly, then you can get these kind of challenges and grievances and all of that. So I think, again, civil servants are going to make use of every option that they have. I do think that, if there's any cases where someone has reported waste, fraud, and abuse, and then they get demoted or removed from a position, then they have, whistleblower protection sort of guidelines on their side, and they can, sort of report this through the system, through IG process and whatnot, and eventually maybe avail themselves of legal options. That's more on an individual kind of case-by-case basis. But, this is going to be, I think, even if the Trump administration were to move forward on it, both the issues that Quinta raised and then some of these other kind of practical implementation things, I think will trip them up, and it won't be something that they can just do overnight, even if it is going to be, the beginning of a fundamental change in kind of the independence of the civil service.
Yeah, and to the point about, it's reclassification, it's not immediate firing. Part of my read of that, and again, Eric, definitely tell me if I'm wrong, is that part of it is just like creating an environment of fear where it will be easier to push you out. Whereas, before, if there, was a policy that as a civil servant you felt should not be pursued for whatever reason, you would have those protections. And so it just creates a kind of additional level of difficulty in, standing up against something that's you think shouldn't be gone through with.
Yeah. But again, if you've got, like, just think about the State Department, for example. Let's just say hypothetically these Schedule F positions were, if they determined that I forget the wording, the confidential policy advising and all of that, let's say it's everything from, so the assistant secretaries on up are, Senate confirmed. But DASs and below are appointments, and usually there's some combination of career officers and then some politicals, some Schedule C. So let's say they reclassify all DASs, office directors and deputy office directors as Schedule F, basically only leaving desk officers as regular civil servants. You could imagine a situation where career civil servants refuse to convert en masse, leave the positions vacant, and in order for the department to keep functioning, maybe they bring in a few politicals here and there to be heads of desks and whatnot, but you've essentially got a bunch of civil servants acting in kind of, senior desk officer roles where they're still protected and they can still voice their concerns even if they don't have the title of, office director or whatnot. It would there's going to be a lot of tension in the system because that's not how that department has functioned. And so I think there's going to be a huge amount of, again, anger towards these Schedule F people that are brought in. But I could imagine a situation where very few civil servants decide to convert. And so they just say, well, leave the position vacant. I'll take this other role that doesn't have a title and I'll keep doing what I'm doing. Scott, do you think that's possible in this scenario?
So I don't know. I think the people implementing Schedule F would say that the funding goes with the birth. And so I don't think that it's as easy for people to hang out and refuse to convert. But I also think that switches over with the due process arguments, right? Because essentially you're being provided a bit of a non-choice. There is a deprivation happening. It's not entirely voluntary for people to hop over. I think it'll be framed that way as saying this is a bit of a switch over to this position, at least in a lot of cases. But at the point where if it is about how this billet, this item, this position is being, that the salary is attached to is being framed, then obviously the actual real choice is between effectively resigning and not having it. So that's why I'm not sure. So I'm not sure exactly how that plays
but just to challenge you on that. So if you're a GS-15 or something at the State Department and you're currently an office director and they come to you and they say, your position is being converted to Schedule F. Do you want to stay in your position? And your choice is to convert to Schedule F, and then you can be fired, but you retain your position and your title. Or you just leave to a different position and you become a floater, or you find a different bureau, or you go back to being a desk officer, but you're still a GS-15. Your salary and your benefits and stuff are with you as a, civil servant.
Yes, but there's a variety of mechanisms in place, I think, already about when Congress cuts funding for an office or increases, there's other legal authorities that kick in about right sizing staffing levels and things like that. So I think if it were a broad, writ large action to say, oh, now we have 10,000 floating civil servants that don't have any positions anymore, that would be other mechanisms in place that they could probably get removed.
I don't know if they can get removed, though. I think there would have to be kind of an off-ramp provided to them where they're offered an early retirement with significant benefits. I mean, basically they'd have to be bought out. Again, I'm no expert on, kind of OPM stuff, but my understanding is these, if you are a tenured civil servant, if you reached, 3 years in government, it is extremely difficult to fire someone without cause.
That may be right. I think this mechanism is precisely meant to undermine the mechanisms that provide that stability and assurity in the ordinary case. But the question is just how legally viable they actually are, for the reasons that it is just a major change in the underlying arrangements that most people understood they were accepting these positions on. And that's something that the Biden administration's final rule really leans into by trying to make express that removal restrictions do transfer with people when they cross different schedules, something that was implied more or less previously. And it's not expressed, that can be changed, but that affects the due process calculus, the level of deprivation. That's entering into the picture here, I think. So we'll have to wait and see exactly how that gets litigated out. And I think we'll have more opportunities to return to the topic in the weeks to come. But for now, let me hand over to you, Quinta, for our third topic.
So we're continuing our bureaucracy-themed RATSEC episode with a conversation about a fun little article published in Vox by Dylan Matthews on INR, the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. The Vox article described it as, and I quote, the obscure federal intelligence bureau that got Vietnam, Iraq, and Ukraine right, and wrote that few people know about it, but if you do know about it, and I quote, you probably know two things. It got big stuff right when the CIA and others screwed up. And when it got that big stuff right, nobody listened to it. So first off, what exactly is this office? And after that, Eric, I'm going to turn to you to defend the honor of the rest of the intelligence community.
Yeah, so INR is a very interesting bureau, which I had the pleasure to interact with when I worked at State, with some regularity, although not a super intense level of interaction. It is the State Department's essentially internal intelligence analysis office, much smaller, certainly by person than most of the rest of the intelligence community. Some rotating Foreign Service officers, predominantly civil servants, though, tend to be people who hang around for a very long time, very much regionalists, at least the people that I interacted with who were working primarily in the Middle East. It was always impressive, the level of depth and historical insight they were brought to their kind of position, often because they were coming from PhDs or masters or other positions where they focused on regional studies and had spent a long time, often in cases, working on particular portfolios. Something that's not terribly common at state, where Foreign Service officers frequently rotate by design, and a lot of civil servants, some hang around in positions for an extended period, but a number end up rotating over the course of their career as well. So that level of deep baked in familiarity isn't always there. It is an odd office and an interesting one in the way it interfaces with the rest of the intelligence community, which, Eric, you're in a better position to talk about than I am. But a interesting and eclectic office that I think really intersects with the State Department's work in interesting ways. But a lot of the INR products I ended up encountering compared to the rest of the intelligence community products tended to be much more, again, of a kind of historical vein, in some cases even kind of like sociological or based on broad historical trends, less about like minute to minute tracking of politics or tracking about debates happening at the real granular level in terms of contemporary actions, in part because that's not what INR does, right? They have political feeds. They get access to intelligence through the intelligence community like other people do, but their bread and butter seem to be much more kind of the longer historical train and bigger picture questions, or at least that's what people tended to write on there with the people I interacted with. Eric, does that jibe with your experience with them? And how does that fit into the broader intelligence community?
That does. It's a much smaller organization than the CIA's Directorate of Analysis or than DIA and NSA, but for its small size, it does pack a significant intellectual punch. And I would say, just based on my experience when I was a CIA analyst writing PDBs, presidential daily briefs, the articles that the president reads every morning about, key developments in the world, or when I was at the National Intelligence Council coordinating intelligence community kind of strategic estimates and other products, getting INR's view was always kind of a critical piece to get a key perspective where kind of groupthink sometimes does overtake CIA. And again, CIA is producing such a much greater volume of intelligence products on a daily basis, just given their size. And like Scott was saying, the kind of minute by minute, what's going on, for example, in the Russo-Ukrainian war. I mean, what are the battle lines today? What's the Russian decision-making on X issue, Ukrainian decision-making on Y issue, kind of analyzing just all the pieces available. If you really want kind of tactical assessments, you'd go to CIA. You wouldn't go to INR. When it comes to the bigger strategic issues, what's Putin thinking? How will the Ukrainian population react to kind of big muscle movements and things like that? INR does have real expertise and insights to add there, and you would get some interesting kind of debates during the coordination process of these IC-wide products. And, there are a lot of kind of running jokes, and it's cited in the Vox report about, INR's kind of mascot being a footnote and their propensity for taking dissents. I mean, there were some bizarre situations where INR would sometimes kind of be a parody of itself. And I wrote once a PDB with an INR co-author, and another part of INR wanted to dissent on its own agency's product, which we told them was not possible. It needed to be an agency position, and INR was already co-authoring this. But again, their propensity to kind of be a little contrarian, I think, is actually a helpful check in our system, because sometimes CIA does start to move in one direction, and it does have this like institutional power to kind of bulldoze other agencies. And INR tends to be the only kind of body that can really offer a substantive comment on the strategic level, because the other intelligence agencies are so much more specialized. DIA is military intelligence. Treasury, only focuses on financial intelligence. FBI has counterintelligence and organized crime, and so on and so forth. And INR, like CIA, is kind of all source political intelligence and can offer the strategic perspective. So, I really enjoyed working with my INR colleagues, even if sometimes they could be a pain in the ass, but I think it was all part of the process.
And I feel like there's something there that actually speaks to the State Department and maybe why INR has like persevered as this kind of eclectic and sometimes pain in the ass office in ways that other bureaucracies don't. In that, like, state is inherently an agency that is, by its mandate, very riven with internal conflict, right? Like the State Department's mandate is the rest of the world, meaning it's like tons of different interests that intersect with that, right? Like unlike any other agency, with Justice Department, yeah, people have differences of opinion on different things, but like the goal is like criminal justice, right? And that comes out when you see their positions on various issues where they're all kind of rowing in the same direction. DoD, the same idea, like military defense is the clearest priority. Some disagreements, but all kind of that's their focus. State doesn't really have that. Go along, get along, advance our objectives and our interests, but who knows what those are. Those vary in context. A lot of people hate that about state. A lot of people complain about that. And that definitely is probably like a big contributor to the fact that a lot of high level foreign policy decision making has gravitated to the National Security Council, because state is a collection of kind of fiefdoms, for lack of a way to describe it. It's like lots of independent offices with a lot of independent ideas that then get kind of channeled into a decision-making process that is very conflicted and has lots of dissenters and lots of different ideas. And it's sometimes really hard to iron out at the secretary level, and it's easier to take those ideas and feed them into the interagency level at the NSC. But that's a virtue too. Like there's a lot of virtue to hearing out dissenting voices and having space for them when you're evaluating particularly complex questions like foreign policy and national security questions, precisely because there is no clear right answer. There's no objective criteria. It is a lot like, jazz or art. It's a lot of feeling of things with different sort of viewpoints and knitting it together. And hopefully you hit on the right solution that will do what you need it to do. And having diverse views and an openness to dissenting opinions, I think is really important. So I'm not surprised that INR can kind of succeed and exist in a State Department type bureaucracy, even as a relatively lesser resourced office. And like, it kind of makes sense in the state environment in a way that it wouldn't in other agencies where there's so much more of a unifying sense of mission. There's a lot more institutional incentive towards alignment with that view, space for disagreement, but in the end, like kind of get in line behind the agency. That's not an attitude the State Department people really any place take lightly, in ways that I think actually have a lot of virtues, though people tend to complain about it more than anything else. We will have to cut our conversation short there because we are out of time for this week. But this would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come. Quinta, what do you have for us this week?
I am once again busting out the New Jersey politics news. And boy, do I have some good stuff for you all. So George Norcross, I think, is a name that if you know anything about New Jersey politics, you're very familiar with. And if you don't, it means nothing. But he is a sort of long-time South Jersey power broker type who's long exerted a lot of influence over the state Democratic Party. And yesterday, he was indicted on, among other things, the RICO. The Attorney General is alleging a sort of 12-year scheme that essentially involves unlawfully obtaining property and fraudulently collecting tax breaks, influencing government officials, all that good stuff. The indictment is definitely a fun read because it includes a bit where Norcross is on a recorded telephone call recounts someone asking, "Are you threatening me?" And then he says, "And I said yes." But really what charmed me the most was that at the press conference by the New Jersey Attorney General to announce the indictment, Norcross himself showed up, not typical, for the announcement of an indictment, and proceeded to sit in the front row in a seat that had been reserved for somebody else. The chutzpah. You simply cannot top it. Incredible stuff all around. I am so excited to see where this case goes.
Well, for my object lesson this week, I have been in a bit of a fallow period musically because I have a new young child at home, as listeners know, and that has severely impeded upon my usual concert attendance in a way that I'm not sure how to remedy or if I will ever be able to remedy, but hopefully I will get back to concert going in a few months when she is a little more manageable by babysitters and outsiders. But I did want to pass along a musical recommendation, as I haven't done that in quite a little while, for what I think is the song of the summer, the album of the summer. For me, that is a kind of charming, kind of country rock or Americana album called Tiger's Blood by Waxahachie, which came out a few months ago. It's really, really a unique sound, primarily like a woman singer-songwriter. I'm blanking on her name now. I think it's Kate Crutchfield. That's right. Has been around for a while. I've released a couple other albums that I've had in the past that I enjoy but never really grabbed me like this one have. But I've listened to it pretty much nonstop for the last few months, and it's really phenomenal. The lead single, Right Back to It, which is kind of a duet with MJ Lenderman, another musician that I wasn't familiar with, but I've been listening to and enjoy as well, is really, really charming and phenomenal and interesting, and a great kind of mellow country summer vibe if you're doing a lot of sitting around the backyard, contemplating, watching fireflies, which is how I'm spending this summer as I have a baby in my lap. It's charming and lovely. So I'll highly recommend that as my object lesson. Check out Tiger's Blood by Waxahachie. Eric, what do you have for us this week?
So I would recommend a travelogue that I'm reading about Central Asia, written by a Norwegian anthropologist named Erika Fatland. The book was published originally in Norwegian in 2015, translated into English, I think in 2020. And, it's broken into 5 parts as she visits the 5 different Central Asian countries. It's beautifully written. It's very funny. The Turkmenistan part in particular is amazing because it's such a bizarre and strange dictatorial country. And she recounts this really strange episode where she was attending. They're really big into kind of horses and horse racing there. And the president of Turkmenistan, former dentist, was doing some sort of maneuvers on horseback and then fell off, and suddenly people were rushing to see if he was okay and, carry him out on a stretcher and whatnot. But the security officials there made sure that no one had any footage on their phone and that it never happened. And we wouldn't be talking about that. And so she was there to experience that live, as well as a number of other bizarre encounters. But it's a great book, and I'm just sort of churning through it and really enjoying it.
With that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare, so be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series. While you're at it, be sure to follow us on Twitter or X at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. In addition, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan. And we are once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patja. On behalf of my co-host Quinta and our special guest Eric Termella, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Till then, goodbye.